welcome to a rather wintry episode of Green Signals, your no-nonsense, no-punches-pulled railway podcast, presented from Lincolnshire by me, Nigel Harris, and
from Derbyshire by me, Richard Bowker.
Indeed. Just before we kick off, just very briefly for us, we pay tribute to Alistair Darling, who died on November the 30th at the very early age of 70. It was a real shock. And Alistair, in my view, which isn't to say I agreed with everything he did, because I didn't, was one of the more competent transport secretaries we've had. And also, behind the scenes, he was not the boring technocrat that the media presented him as. He was warm, friendly, wry, funny. And I always enjoyed the meetings I had with him every few weeks for the 4 years he was at the DFT. Richard, you must have known him a lot better. You will have seen him much more often.
I did know him well. I, like you, I was deeply shocked and saddened. He was a decent man. We had many great conversations and a couple of really good laughs, quite a few actually. I didn't agree with some of the things he wanted to do, not least obviously the railways bill of 2004, but I think it was a mark of him that although we disagreed, we still got on, and he was incredibly decent. So I'm desperately sad, and I echo all you say.
Interesting, you use the same word twice then. You use the word decent. And that's the one word that appeared in all the tributes and obituaries to him I read right across the political spectrum. He was a good bloke, I felt, though of course I didn't agree with his stance on trams and of course abolishing the SRA and a number of other things, but you could always have the discussions with him, and he was very civilised. Anyway, I've written a piece, a tribute to Alistair, which is on our website, I think. Do have a read of that if you want a little peer behind the public face. So, moving on to the meat of this episode. The weeks really seem to fly by producing these podcasts, don't they, Richard?
I certainly do.
God, as the tail lamp of one podcast disappears down the track, you look the other way and the headlamps of the next one are in sections, so to speak.
Oh, well, that's a nice analogy. I like
Do you?
Analogy.
Do you like
that's
that?
Good. Yeah. That's very railway. That's good.
There you go. I thought so too. I was lying awake last night thinking of that one. Anyway, last week's show was a good one, which we think they all are, of course, featuring retired top railway manager Graham Eccles, who has an entirely justified reputation for really knowing his onions on the one hand and for speaking the unvarnished plain truth on the other. And that can be a bit uncomfortable, Richard, can't it? I'm sure you've experienced it from time to time when you were working with him.
Yeah, once or twice.
You were never in any doubt what he thought, anyway.
No.
Anyway, Graham gave a masterclass in how industrial relations on the railway have developed since BR days and how we've come to be mired in the current mess, with yet another slew of reputation-wrecking drivers' strikes imminent in the run-up to Christmas. Richard, you've had a look at some of the reactions we've had to that podcast.
I have, but before we talk about those, did you see? I mean, we're recording this sort of a bit after the event, but did you see the tweet that Mark Harper, Secretary of State for Transport, put out about ASLEF drivers and Labour having parties over Christmas and wrecking your everybody's year end? I just couldn't believe that if you really wanted to resolve a dispute, that was the way around. That was the way to go about doing it. And I mean, I don't normally get remotely political, but I was so shocked by that, I actually responded accordingly. Other people's reactions have been really interesting. Phil Two Hoots said, "That's a great handle. That's a really
great handles, aren't they? Yeah.
He said, "So good to have the clear-sighted view and wise words from Mr. Eccles. Experience counts." We'll absolutely concur with that.
Yeah.
And Alan Morton said, "An excellent background to the strike position for all sides from Graham." And obviously, we agree with both of those. But you had you spotted a tweet from a very interesting quarter.
Indeed. David Horn, the managing director of LNER, no less, for it was he, said, "I haven't worked for Graham Eccles since 2006, but listening to his interview with Nigel and Richard on Green Signals has brought a big smile to my face. He is as wise and sharp as ever, and I'm looking forward to his next comeback, of which he's had more than Frank Sinatra. So thank you, David, for that. Just one comment on your views about Mark Harper's tweet. Can you imagine any circumstances in which Alistair Darling would ever have said anything like that? I can't.
No, because he just would have risen above. That just would not have occurred to him. But it was just the lack of self-awareness and the fact that somebody somewhere thought, yeah, that'll do it, and pressed send.
Exactly.
It's just quite extraordinary. No, you're quite right. But he wouldn't have done that, Alistair.
No, just thinking about it, Alistair, more than we have been doing, obviously because it came to attention within dying, is that, he was a statesman, wasn't he? Not just a politician, and we need more statesmen and less politicians. If you look at the calibre around the cabinet table now, where there's so much self-serving backstabbing and spite, is it any wonder that the political process is in such disrepute?
No. On that happy, positive note.
Sorry, I'll try and cheer it up a bit. Anyway, I will cheer it up right now because on today's show we have something really positive. But before we dive right in, I should explain that we recorded 2 absolutely brilliant interviews at the weekend, and they were so good. We had far too much material for one podcast. So the 3 of us quickly took the decision to do 2 separate episodes from the 2 interviews, the first of which you'll hear today. And that therefore meant we had to re-record the beginning and end bits of this podcast in particular. So those of you listening on audio can relax because you won't notice any difference. Those watching on YouTube, and many of you do, surprisingly, and it continues to surprise me, given that all you get to look at is me and my mucker Richard jawing away about railways, but we are very welcome. Please keep coming. Those of you watching on YouTube will notice a difference. But we so wanted to bring you all this fantastic content. That's why we've done it in the way we decided. So, if you ask most people involved with the railways in the UK to point to one place where, on the face of it at least, things seem to be going well, and they'll likely say Scotland. There's investment, electrification, reopenings, and a real sense of a joined-up operation that we just do not see south of Hadrian's Wall. Scotland's also embarked on a fascinating pilot scheme to scrap peak fares, which some will say is brave and progressive. Others, however, point to real concerns with yield, and I think that includes Richard, and a growing gap in the railway finances. And of course, once you've offered passengers something like this, it's very difficult to row back from it. So have policymakers in Scotland just made something of a rod for their own backs? To discuss these points and many more besides, we are delighted to welcome to the show Alex Hynes, Managing Director of Scotland's Railway, delivered, of course, through the ScotRail Alliance. Alex has had a somewhat stellar and varied career in the railway industry. He was an economist at the ORR. I didn't know that, actually. Strategic Planning Manager, Rail at Go Ahead. I didn't know him then. Commercial Director at London Midland, Managing Director, Rail Development at Go Ahead, Managing Director at Northern Rail, and then Arriva Rail Northern. And since 2017, Managing Director of Scotland's Railway. Alex Hynes, welcome to Green Signals.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here.
And we're very pleased about that. So, Alex, let's just kick off with a big picture. Over the last few years, there's been a remarkable level of activity on Scotland's railway. Many folks south of the border might look rather enviously, and we do, at electrification, railway reopenings, new stations, and smaller but vitally important capacity and performance enhancement schemes that we all know make a huge difference. Put simply, how has this been possible in Scotland when it seems so difficult everywhere else?
Well, that's a big question. And I think to help me answer it, I would say that Scotland has a national transport strategy. And everything we do on the railway in Scotland is aligned with that national transport strategy, which sounds a bit motherhood and apple pie, but actually it's true, and I think we can demonstrate it. And these National Transport Strategy in Scotland is underpinned by 4 things we're trying to do as a country. We're trying to reduce inequalities, we're trying to take climate action, we're trying to drive inclusive economic growth, and we're trying to improve the health and well-being of the people who live in Scotland. So everything you see us do through Transport Scotland's delivery partners, whether that's Network Rail Scotland or ScotRail, is aimed at delivering our part of a broader transport strategy. So the context, is really quite different from some other places. It's sort of clearer and more aligned. And obviously, at a railway level, we believe the railway is a system. We have a fragmented railway, and that's why we have the alliance between ScotRail and Network Rail. And then we appoint one person who tries to oversee both, and that's me. And I think we can demonstrate by some of the things we deliver for passengers and taxpayers that actually track and train working together is the best way to run a railway. And no doubt during the course of our conversation, we'll touch on, some of those things we're delivering right now. So we have a strategy and we have a plan, and we're more than a railway.
And just talking about that structural point then, because you mentioned there everything's sort of done in a more kind of joined up, inclusive way. Yet nonetheless, Network Rail is still a legal entity. I suppose ScotRail, the train company is a separate legal entity. So does this work by kind of force of personality, really, or is it more structurally integrated than that? How does day to day? How does it actually work?
I mean, it's a brilliant question, and there have been some highs and lows, and there have been some things that worked and some things that didn't. So the first thing to say is that one of the things Transport Scotland does is when it contracts with Network Rail Scotland or ScotRail, it sets a line target. So the best example of that is on performance, where they say to Network Rail Scotland and to ScotRail, your target is 92.5% ppm, and you are required to work together to deliver it. And so when we have our performance improvement executive meeting, which is a joint meeting between ScotRail and Network Rail, which I attend every 4 weeks, you can't tell in that room who works for who, because it's just a bunch. It's just a bunch of railway professionals trying to get the trains to run on time. Now, of course, further south, track and train don't have aligned performance targets. You might have a train operating company with a T-3 target, and you might have a Network Rail route with an on-time target. And so, you get these arguments around, well, what currency should we use and what's the target? And all that time you spend having that conversation is time you're not spending getting the trains to run on time. Now, when Abellio bid for the previous ScotRail franchise, they bid a deep alliance, they bid a alliance MD, an alliance agreement, and actually that's not changed since that time, 2014. My predecessor pursued a policy of integration, and he integrated lots of functions between ScotRail and Network Rail. And in my opinion, that didn't work very well, because as you quite rightly point out, Richard, Network Rail Scotland isn't even a company, it's a bit of Network Rail Infrastructure Limited.
Yeah.
ScotRail Trains Limited is an incorporated entity in its own right. And so the strategy of sort of integration without alignment actually, I think, led to lots of problems. So when I arrived in 2017, the railway in Scotland wasn't working terribly well. I consciously uncoupled some parts of the alliance and actually disintegrated some of it, because my main priority was just to get ScotRail and Network Rail Scotland to work. Okay. The alliance doesn't actually employ anybody. So you either work for ScotRail or you work for Network Rail. And I'm a Network Rail employee, and I'm a statutory director of ScotRail, and I'm the MD of both. And I try and wear those two hats in balance. So when I'm in Glasgow, I literally divide my time between the ScotRail offices and the Network Rail offices. And in every interaction I have in my job, I'm always wearing those two hats. It would be easy to pursue the narrow interest of one organisation in this alliance. But it actually, if you focus on the big picture and the joint interest, I think you can deliver great things.
Yeah.
So it's had highs and lows. We've done some good things. We've done some less good things. I think the Transport Scotland expect ScotRail and Network Rail people to work together on the priorities of the Scottish ministers. And it's my job to create an environment where people do that.
I think it's a profoundly important point you make, that structural and legal integration is not the same thing as aligned objectives from a group of people. Yeah, and it makes perfect sense.
And I think alignment is the strongest positive force, more so than integration.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Your point about the people in the room not knowing which work for what makes that point absolutely, doesn't it?
Well, and here's a great example, right? So the target for ScotRail and Network Rail, 92.5% ppm, that is a whole industry measure, okay? So if the ScotRail folk move the minutes and the ppm failures to Network Rail, and the Network Rail folk move the minutes and the ppm failures to Network Rail, that doesn't help deliver the target.
Yeah.
One of the things you said there, Alex, about, is it all is too much of it maybe dependent on you, as because organisations which depend for the success on individual people. I mean, the skills you've got to have there in the interpersonal skills, the balancing the two hats and all the rest of it, you've got to get that right, haven't you? So is it a bit too much based on you?
I don't think so, if I'm honest. As you know, I came up through the train operating company business. And the reason why I came to Scotland to do this job is to actually learn the infrastructure as well. So actually, on the infrastructure side, I'm still learning, and I rely on my team at Network Rail Scotland to keep me right on that. My job is to focus on the priorities that the Scottish Government want the railway to deliver, and they are 5 things. Everyone home safe every day, to reduce the net cost of the railway, to deliver net zero, to run a reliable railway, and for track and train to work together. And if and when I ever move on, my successor will do exactly those things.
Okay.
To do this job, you do have to be relatively good at stakeholder management. Scotland is a very noisy environment. We've got a parliament and we've got a media. You've got, the context is completely different. When I was doing the job of MD Northern, I wasn't a public figure. I wasn't doing any of that under the scrutiny. Whereas in Scotland, there's lots of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And it makes it a more challenging environment in which to deliver. And we spend lots of time with our stakeholders, understanding what they want, talking to them all the time in good times and bad, and making sure that the folk in ScotRail and Network Rail Scotland are delivering for those stakeholders, because when we don't, it gets very noisy very quickly.
Okay, let's turn to some operational stuff and start with one of the biggest issues facing the railway across the country, nowhere more so than Scotland, and that's infrastructure and climate resilience. You had a particularly painful illustration of where it goes wrong at Carmont, and thereafter you got your helicopter, so there's something that Rishi Sunak would approve of, I'm sure, there. But you've had your fair share of those challenges, and they're continuing. In the last conversation I had with you, you said something which still is going round in my mind. Oh, no, it was Sean on the helicopter. He said, we have to look out for even a farmer changing the direction he ploughs the field. If he's been ploughing parallel with a railway, then that's fine. He said, if he changes the direction ploughs at right angles to the railway, you get all those drainage channels pointing at your railway. So they're really down to the real macro level of that. I mean, is everything sort of back to normal following the recent disruption you had? And what sort of is it left you thinking about for the future in these issues? Because they are huge, particularly in a hilly, mountainous, and dare one say it, dreich and wet country like Scotland.
Well, I believe that running a safe and reliable railway in the face of climate change is the challenge of a generation. And we had a very, very painful lesson on the 12th of August 2020. And what we know now, which we didn't know then, is climate change is affecting Scotland more than the other three nations of the UK. And this is where devolution of Network Rail is actually quite powerful, because I've got some flexibility to do some different things north of the border rather than there being one single approach. So since that terrible day, obviously we've spent lots of time on the infrastructure. We've changed the way we operate the weather in extreme and adverse weather. We've modified the high-speed trains, and we believe we've become the first railway control to have full-time meteorologists in our control centre. So they have been an absolute game changer. We are now making better decisions earlier, which enables us to communicate them to customers and the public, and people know what's going on. So, we had a few weeks ago 2 red weather alerts in a week for rainfall. They weren't actually on the west of the country, because it rains 3 to 5 times more in the west than it does in the east. These red weather alerts were actually in the east of the country, where arguably the infrastructure is less able to cope with extreme rainfall. And we're making those decisions quicker. We also took the decision that in the event of a Met Office red weather alert, we don't try and run trains in that area, because what the climate change experts will tell you, and by the way, everything they've predicted is happening. I don't know whether you're tracking the climate trends this year, but they are terrifying. We're talking about trying to reduce carbon emissions to reduce global warming to 1.5 degrees. If this year is any indication of the future, we're on track for 3 degrees warming.
3 degrees they're talking about, aren't they?
This is scary stuff. And we've equipped ourselves to better, look after those challenges. So are we back to normal from that perspective? Yes, we absolutely are. I think we did a good job. One of our key KPIs is, did we have any stranded trains? We didn't have any stranded trains.
Oh, right. Okay.
We didn't expose our passengers or staff to risk. And actually, we communicated what we were going to do so well that after the event, actually the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Net Zero and Energy visited our control centre to say thank you to the folk who work there. Obviously, it's an integrated control between ScotRail and Network Rail, to say what a great job they've done. And then, of course, our sort of industry-leading social media presence means we can get our message across.
You are very good at that.
It's a corporate capability. Again, it's not a me thing. We've invested in social media, and the ScotRail and Network Rail accounts, Network Rail Scotland accounts, they are run by one team. So it's the ScotRail team who do Network Rail Scotland's social media, and working together, the ScotRail and Network Rail comms team do an amazing job. They never blame each other. They can explain issues, whether they related to track or to train. And we specifically request our frontline teams, whether they're in ScotRail or in Network Rail, to, when they're first on site, just get loads of pictures and video. Yeah. And we get it out on social media, and we can explain to people. And once you show people the pictures and the videos, they go,
they do get it.
I get it.
I did mean you corporately rather than you personally in that respect.
Good.
Because, I'm sure, maybe the staff do like it, but one of the things I always enjoy in the winter is a steady stream of Scotland and Network Rail, you know what I'm going to say, videos of 37s on snowplows and ploughing drifts aside, and some of the glorious images that guards have shot from the back cabs of trains of that wonderful landscape in a winter wonderland. So I do hope they continue doing that this year, Alex.
They absolutely will.
We talked about trains. Let's just move on to trains briefly. You are the last place in the country now still operating the venerable high-speed train. Which I don't know whether that's because you've had the foresight to realise that if you actually retire them, you haven't got anything to replace them with, as happened sort of south of the border. So we've ended up with sort of short formations and rolling stock challenges. What is the rolling stock strategy for the train strategy for Scotland? Because they are getting on a bit now. I mean, they're not that much younger than I am. So what's the plan? And I presume this is all part of a rolling programme of electrification as well, is it?
Yeah. So the strategy for ScotRail rolling stock is aligned with the decarbonisation strategy.
Right.
So the strategy teams in ScotRail and Network Rail work together and say, okay, we've got these fleets. We know we need to remove the diesel ones and replace them with carbon zero trains. When will they life expire? Because, of course, we don't want to replace trains earlier than we need to, because trains are expensive. So if you look at our fleet, it's actually relatively old, and it's getting older. The average fleet age in ScotRail is about 22 years. So it's the wrong side. It's the wrong side of 20 years. If you say a train lasts for 40 years, you probably want the average age of your fleet to be 20, some older, some newer. So we need to remove diesel vehicles from the network, but we're not going to do it before those diesel trains are life expired. The high-speed trains are on lease to us for 2030. Our anticipation would be they get replaced with maybe a hybrid electric train beyond then. We are looking at the possibility of whether there's a business case to replace them prior to 2030, and we'd like to go to the market and talk about that. That requires the permission of Scottish Government. So we know we need a new intercity train for Scotland, and we need to agree that strategy sooner rather than later, because 2030 is not very long away in railway terms. Our procurement activity on electric trains and battery electric trains is very well advanced. And actually, we've been ready to go for some time. We're just getting clarity from the Scottish Government around what the funding available is for that. And the strategy there is to buy battery electric multiple units to exploit the bits of the network that we will partially electrify in the first instance. Right. Because for Fife and Borders, our strategy is to partially electrify first and then fully electrify later. So for that, you need battery electric multiple units.
So is that what's happening on Leavenmouth, Alex? Because I think that's electrified from Thornton Junction to Leavenmouth, isn't it? But obviously not electrified on the main line.
So Leavenmouth is being built electrification ready, but it is not. Okay. It is not being built with the electrification system in place. So if you look at the drone footage for Leavenmouth, all the foundations for the electrification masts are in. They've been built as part of the project. Right. We're not actually putting the wires up, because obviously it takes time to procure a battery electric train.
Yeah.
We've also got some electrics in the Strathclyde area which are approaching life expiry, and we need some new electric trains to replace them. So that's an electric for electric. It's not actually a decarbonisation project. It's just they're getting old and need replacing. So in 2020, Transport Scotland published its decarbonisation action plan, and it basically said we need to decarbonise the railway in Scotland. We also need to drive modal shift. Scotland has some of the toughest climate change targets in the world, and the trajectory to get there is also enshrined in legislation. So UK net zero 2050, in Scotland we're 2045 net zero. And when that strategy was published, it said we want to remove diesel vehicles from the network by 2035. But it also committed to us refreshing that plan after 3 years. So we are literally in the process between Transport Scotland, Scottish Rail Holdings, ScotRail and Network Rail of rewriting that decarbonisation action plan. Obviously, the world looks a wee bit different from 3 years ago, and money is tight. So, the commitment to decarbonisation and electrification is undimmed. The bit that's changed, of course, is the public finances are a bit tighter. Yep. So, we're working with the Scottish Government on refreshing that strategy, and that will be published in due course.
Right.
But of course, we're just about to complete the electrification of Bar Head. We're on the park electrifying East Kilbride. We've built Lever Mouth, which is electrification ready. The mega project we're going to deliver is essentially the electrification between Dunblane and Aberdeen via Perth and Dundee. And we are already doing site investigation work, ground investigation work. We are taking down bridges which are foul of an electrified railway, doing some of that work already. And as I'm sure you're aware, we've done some great work to drive down the unit cost of electrification in Scotland. And one of the ways we've done that is to look at it as a programme. So the Scottish Government gave us 120 million quid to go and upgrade power supply across the network in advance of electrification. And we get economies of scale rather than doing it on a project-by-project basis. And so, even though we don't have the full and final authority for some of these schemes like Fife, Borders and Aberdeen, we're already on the park upgrading the power supply in anticipation of it. Brilliant. So it really is quite joined up. And, guess what? If you've got a long-term plan, kind of everyone knows how to put the pieces of the jigsaw together,
Yeah. It's just so good to hear all that, isn't it, Richard? That integrated thinking, especially the power supplies. We wouldn't want to end up with a load of trains that take too much power, would we? We've been there once before. But it is great to hear it. It really is, Alex. It's encouraging and inspirational, and for reasons which I'm sure you'll appreciate, frustrating for us to listen to, because it's just the sort of thing we need to have down here. One of the hottest political topics in Scotland are the sleeper services. We're not going to talk about politics. You'll be delighted to know of the sleepers today. Maybe we'll come back to that on another occasion. No, let's rephrase that. We will come back to that on another occasion. But we want to talk about operational stuff and costs. Having spent tens of millions of pounds, surely we could have bought quality rolling stock. Why the problems with the Mark Vs? We've seen TPE withdraw a virtually brand new fleet of CAF vehicles, and the sleepers have had the problem. What went wrong with Circle as well? Was nationalising it the only way forward? So there's a number of questions there: the quality of the stock, the operator, the nationalisation question. Well, over to you.
Well, obviously, with my Network Rail hat on, Sleeper are a valued customer. In fact, I had dinner with Catherine Darbandy, the managing director, earlier on this week. And I think, first of all, the separation of Sleeper from the main ScotRail business, I think everyone regards as a roaring success. And, that has really worked because it's allowed Sleeper to focus on their market, which is, pretty distinct and different.
And they've done it well.
And they've done it brilliantly, and their revenue line demonstrates that. You can. I'm trying to get on it next week, and I can't because it's full. So the new train introduction is painful, right? So we introduced the Hitachi 385s. They were late. We had issues with them, widely publicised. You remember the windscreen.
The windscreens, the ghost images of signals.
It's horrible. And so, Sleeper had their new train introduction challenges as well. But personally, as a customer, I think their new trains are an absolute game changer. I was pretty sceptical about whether a shower would work on board a train. and it does, and it's bloody brilliant. And actually, you know, if you look at the commercial performance of Sleeper, the people are voting with their feet. You know, that people love it, which is why it's full, which is why I can't get on it. There's this fantastic, no, it's not an anecdote, fantastic fact. So the Sleeper takes in 1 year to Fort William double the population of Fort William. So the economics of Sleeper is not the revenue it takes and the cost of the operation. The economics of Sleeper is what it does for Scotland PLC.
Okay.
And the biggest customer group, as I understand it, on Sleeper are, you know, relatively wealthy people from England who come up to Scotland on the Sleeper and spend loads of money. That is a good thing. So again, it's more than a railway. It's actually bringing money into Scotland, into the visitor economy, which is a big part of the economy in Scotland. And, you know, I think inbound tourism to Scotland last year grew by 28% or something. You know,
Wow.
brand Scotland is strong around the globe, and you know the Sleeper is real, you know, bucket list stuff. So you know, I think Catherine Darbandy and her team at Sleeper are doing a fab job, and they're a key part of this transport strategy which we talked about earlier on.
Yeah, and
So
I must admit, I used it not that recently, but had the pleasure of using it, and the breakfast that they did, I've got to say, was absolutely superb. So yeah, and I take your point about Scottish PLC,
Yeah.
but you've also just touched on what people pay. So let's just talk about the big one. Well, the big one for me, as I suppose, as thinking about the income for the railway as a whole. So the decision to move to scrap off-peak fares, although it's quite complicated. When I was looking at it, it's quite detailed. Where you know, with season tickets unchanged, and super off-peaks were actually got rid of completely. So there's a bit of detail there, but it's a big decision, right? Because as Nigel said at the sort of the top of the interview, really, it's one of those things that's quite difficult to row back from. So how's it going? Is it working? And bottom line, Alex, has the yield tanked?
Right. Okay. So if you step back from a minute and you look at what we do in ScotRail, our customer satisfaction is at record high levels. 91% customer satisfaction. Our satisfaction has never been higher. So, and of course, we know we can make it better, and we will. So our existing customers are relatively satisfied, but a lot of people find rail expensive. And if we are going to decarbonise Scotland, we need to drive modal shift. And the price that people pay is a barrier to that. So the Off-Peak All Day initiative is what I call a spend to decarbonise project. This is a £15 million investment by the Scottish Government to abolish peak fares for a trial of 6 months and see what happens. We expected it to increase our passenger numbers, and we expected it to cost us money. And that's exactly what's happened. So, you know, we launched it in October. Actually, since then, we've had a tremendous amount of weather-related disruption. So it's actually been a little bit tricky to see what's actually been the underlying performance of it. But we think we're about 4% busier in terms of passenger journeys. Right. And we think we will deliver the trial within the budget we were given by the Scottish Government, which is 15 million for 6 months. And so, yes, it has essentially given away some of our revenue. But I think context here is important, because our farebox revenue this year is 325 million. And we are the fastest growing train operating company in Britain. And we've recently upgraded our revenue forecast for this year by 50 million, 50. So I think, you know, £15 million is a lot of money for the ScotRail coffers, but of course our underlying business is trading brilliantly well. And of course £15 million in Scottish Government terms is not a huge sum of money. Now, of course, Scottish ministers always have been responsible for fares and always will be. And, you know, it's a great privilege to be part of this trial. It's gone really well. All the retail stuff worked well. We didn't see lots of overcrowding, which was a real risk. We added additional carriages to services where we thought we needed it. And customers love it. But obviously, the way we're going to evaluate the impact of the trial is ScotRail is going to do what it's done for us, and Transport Scotland are going to do an evaluation of, these extra passengers we've got. Where did they come from? Did they come from car? Did they come from bus? Did they make new trips? Do they just work from their homes less often? And then the Scottish Government will make a decision about the future. So few sort of perspectives from mine. You're probably not going to change where you live, where you work, or sell your car on the basis of a 6-month trial, are you?
No.
So this trial is exactly that. We're just getting a taste of what the behavioural change might be if you wanted to make it a more permanent arrangement, ? The other thing is, because we were concerned about the risk of overcrowding, we deliberately didn't do any paid-for advertising. We used our own channels, and obviously we got lots of PR out of it. And actually, the paid-for advertising starts in January, where we're actually going to push it quite hard.
Okay.
Because, of course, the autumn is generally busier than the new year. So we're probably going to have more surplus capacity in the new year. So we're going to push it much harder along the lines of reboot your commute. And yeah, it's, someone, not me, has got a big decision to make in the new year.
Well, they have, but the maths is really interesting, right? So you reckon you're about 4% busier, right? If your income base is around about 350 million and it's costing you around 15 million, then oddly enough, that's costing you about 4%, 5%, isn't it? So I'm amazed by that and excited, actually, because I thought the yield impact would be a lot more than that. What is interesting, though, of course, I suspect another factor in here is work from home, hybrid working, the effect that the season ticket, if you think of your basket of fares, the season ticket income was probably going down anyway. So we've got lots of variables moving around. But in terms of when we're seeing a leisure railway as well, really booming across the whole of the country, that kind of ratio of yield loss to volume growth, that's positive.
It is, isn't it? Richard, just before we move off that point, for the sake of the many listeners and viewers, I'm sure, who are not railway managers or even accountants, do you want to just explain in a couple of sentences what yield is?
So yield is, it's a really simple thing that if you say, if it's price times volume, basically. So if something costs £10 and 3 people buy it, we've yielded £30. If we reduce the cost to £5, and more people buy it, but say only 5 people buy it, our yield has actually gone down from £30 to £25. Excellent. So more people are buying it, but we're actually getting a bit less revenue. Our yield from those passengers has gone down. So that's why what Alex is explaining is so important. And I am really encouraged by those numbers.
Absolutely. And of course, it costs more to service those people for less money, doesn't it? So.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alex, go on. You were going to say.
No, I was just going to say, if you did this pre-COVID, when the rail market was relatively inelastic, then it would have been commercial suicide.
Yeah.
But of course, since COVID, the rail market has become much more elastic. And actually, Scotland has really embraced hybrid working.
Yeah.
So much so that Saturday is our busiest day on the railway in Scotland, which is not the case. Which is not the case in England.
No.
In England, even though there's been a leisure boom, which we've seen in Scotland, Mondays to Fridays are still busier than Saturdays. In Scotland, that is not the case. Saturday's our busiest day.
So let's very briefly explain elastic and inelastic. So this is a good economist term here. So no, it's great. No, we're constantly. Nigel is constantly saying, yeah. Stop using words. Explain it in English. So, and he's quite right. So if something is elastic,
Always.
if you put the price up, a lot of people might decide they're very sensitive to it, so they might stop buying it. If something is inelastic, like a season ticket, you can almost say, I can put it up quite a lot because they've got no choice. They've got to do it. So the more inelastic a market is, the more you can kind of price it up. And as you say, a season ticket market was quite inelastic. A leisure market is much more elastic. So you're 100% right. I totally agree. You couldn't have done this pre-COVID, but we've a different mix now, haven't we? Yeah.
The good thing about an elastic market, as you've just described it, Richard, as well, is that the railway is compelled, if it's got any sense, to up its game in terms of service, to give a better product to people, because the elasticity works two ways, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And one of the things I love about what Alex is doing in Scotland is you're sweating the little stuff as well. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I mean, give you an example of that I think is brilliant. You're putting more vehicles on trains to carry cycles, so you're attracting that market. And I saw something where you're having to extend some platforms at some of the West Highland stations to be able to accommodate it. It's not just the big stuff. It's really back to your four main objectives of what Scotland's trying to achieve. Is that how's that pilot rolled out now, or are you still in the process of doing that?
So in the National Transport Strategy for Scotland, there's a hierarchy of modes, and at the top is walking, wheeling, and cycling. That's great. We should all do more walking, wheeling, and cycling. And at the bottom is private car, and public transport sits in the middle, right?
Yeah.
So we want to make our rail network more attractive to people who walk, wheel, and cycle. So if you take cycling, we've got the Highland Explorer product, the Class 153s, which are just fabulous. But we can't add them to 6-car 156s everywhere because we need 7-car platforms there. So we've done some good work between ScotRail and Network Rail on some cheap and cheerful platform extension proposals for the West Highland line, which hopefully Transport Scotland will be able to fund, and then we can use more services. Will get a Highland Explorer vehicle added to them. On the high-speed trains, we actually took out a bay of 4 seats and put more cycle storage in there. And what a game changer that has been. It's been, feedback from customers and crew has been absolutely superb. This summer we had the cycling championships in Scotland. That was a major event for us, and it went brilliantly well. And the UCI, the organisers, have a legacy fund, believe it or not, which we tapped into, and we're labelling all the fleet to show customers where to get on the train if they've got a cycle. And also, you can now book a cycling space through the ScotRail app, which we weren't able to do before. And that's all being funded through the legacy fund. So, what this predates me, by the way. The folk in ScotRail have a very, very strong customer instinct, and we're always trying to get better all of the time.
And I think a lot of that, if I can say, probably goes back to the days of people like Chris Green, and others. It has kind of always been thus, hasn't it, for as long as I can remember. And you're doing a great job, I have to say, of continuing that legacy. But it has been there for some time,
and developing it. And the point you make, Richard, is one which I've certainly noticed as well, that Scotland isn't afraid to get into the detail of small schemes, which a lot of other people would say, it's not worth it. Well, it is worth it. And there's real value in it. So well done, Alex, and more power to your elbow. It's as I say, it's inspirational and frustrating to hear, and I just hope that people south of the border pay a bit of attention to this, not least Merriman and Harper, who could do well to listen to some of the things that you're doing. Just one very last quick answer, Alex. What's the biggest challenge for Scotland Railways over the next 5 or 10 years? If you had to boil it down, say that's the thing that's the biggest challenge.
Well, we need to continue to run a safe and reliable railway in the face of climate change, and we need to be more efficient because we consume lots of taxpayers' money and the public finances are tight, and we need to make sure that we continue to get the money we need to invest in our services. And that means we need to be efficient because we're competing directly with, investment in health, education, etc. And so that's why one of the things we attempt to do relentlessly is to drive down the unit cost of the railway.
Yeah.
So that the government continue to afford to buy it. And so whether you look at electrification or the cost of new stations, we can build a new station in Scotland for 15 million quid. And guess what? We're building new stations. We can electrify railways for about 2 million per single track kilometre, and guess what? The Scottish Government wants to buy it. So that relentless drive for efficiency, and by the way, not at the expense of quality, because only the best will do, north of the border, is a key part of our agenda. So I would say safety, reliability, efficiency.
Good answer.
Brilliant.
Alex, we really do appreciate you taking the time out. I know you've got a busy schedule, so thanks ever so much for coming on the show. I'm sure you'll be back again at some point because there's plenty of things that we'd like to discuss, and we'd like to keep our finger on the pulse of the ongoing experience with the fares experiment, which is really, really important. And, all the very best for Scotland's Railway. And just smiling, Richard, given the discussion we had the other day about the problems of masses of luggage that can't be carried. Here we've got an operator taking seats out of a train.
Indeed.
Which is, we'll leave that one hanging in the air. But thanks ever so much for coming on, Alex. We really appreciate it. And I hope that, in fact, both of us, both Richard and me, can pay a visit to Scotland fairly soon, and we can break bread and see a bit of this I always enjoy coming to Scotland. As you know, the last time I was there, I had a bit of a ticket issue at Queen Street. And I went the morning after to find out when I headed for the barrier. And before I had a chance to speak, a smiling chap on the barrier said, "Good morning, Nigel. What can we do for you today?" Which gives a chap a good feeling, But there you go. But thanks ever so much, Alex. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Alex.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Well, what a fascinating discussion, Richard. Don't know about you, but I always find it really inspiring to listen to railway leaders who are so relentlessly half full and utterly determined to create a better railway. And I come away from that really energised and inspired. How about you?
Yeah, I did, and it's not just half full and from a sort of a slightly foolish kind of way. I mean, Alex is one of the brightest and the best, and it's yes, it's positive, but it's also grounded in really good organisation and great leadership and team building and and stakeholder management, which they've done superbly. So I came really positive. I tell you my sort of big sort of takeaways, I guess, from that were two things. One, that when he talked about the fact that he didn't really need a sort of a legal vertical integration to make things work or a legally structured change. I mean, in fact, he'd actually undone some of that.
That was interesting, wasn't it?
Really interesting. And what he'd actually done was created aligned objectives. Right? And I think there is something really important for the rest of the UK to listen to there. So that was important. But the other thing that I came away really quite energised about was the fares work that's going on. Those numbers, I think I got my numbers a bit wrong, actually. Yeah, it was 15 million. Obviously, that was for 6 months.
6 months.
Trial,
not a
yeah,
year.
well, it's a 12-month trial when you're
But the
looking
principle holds good, Richard. You were right on the principle.
The principle, I think, is fine, and yes, it is going to be a cost to the Exchequer, but they haven't, as he said, they haven't really marketed it heavily yet, and that's going to generate more income, hopefully, without a commensurate increase in cost. There might be a little bit, but not a huge amount. So that I thought was really positive. Numbers were much better than I expected. Who, me, cynical accountant? No, they were much better than I expected. And if he gets that right, and if they do extend that, we could be looking at something really interesting as a template for south of the border to maybe follow.
Indeed. Well, your state of mind was rather given away by your first question, which was, I think, did your yield tank?
Yes. Okay.
Which
yeah. Sorry for that.
Gave us all a bit of a hint as to where you were coming from. But I completely agree that it's not naive pie in the sky stuff, is it? It's all really rooted from experience, and the aligned objectives thing. We ought to repeat it all the time. In all honesty, it's not the first time we've heard that. I mean, even Gerald Corbett, going right back to here's my famous phrase, the early part of the 12th century, used to talk about aligned objectives or misaligned objectives.
Yeah.
But Alex has actually made it work. He's made it real about it. Doesn't matter who owns it or what the formalities are. It's how you run it that really counts.
And it comes from within, and it comes from good leaders tapping into a desire from good people to want to make things better. I mean, I was lucky enough to see it on the West Coast Route Modernisation 20 odd years ago when we got everybody in a room to sort that out. And there was no legal structure there. I couldn't compel anybody to do anything. But actually, a lot of people suddenly realised this was not the way to do it, and there was a better way, and they came together, and we created aligned objectives, and it worked, and it can work that way again.
There's nothing to beat everybody pulling on the same rope, is there?
No.
It's just really good. So we will be watching that, and I'm sure we'll be heading north of the border again fairly soon, if only digitally, to check on the process or progress of that FAIRS experiment. And like you, I wish him well, because there's a really exciting prospect for everybody to follow if it works as there are hints that it is doing, and as we all hope it will. So good luck to Scotland as ever. Right, so that's about it for this week. Do let us know what you thought of today's show on @GreenSignalers on X, formerly Twitter, together with any suggestions of things you think we should cover. We've got a heck of a list, but one or two people have just in passing comments have given us a really good idea, which is on the list. So you could make it. Please let us know what you think. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe on podcast platforms and on YouTube. It really does make a big difference to us. And ensures more people get to find out about Green Signals. Do add comments on YouTube, and you can contact us on the info@ address on the website. We do try to answer all emails eventually, usually a bit slower in my case, as Richard and Steph want to point out, but I'm not going to change the habits of a lifetime now. Do keep your questions coming in for our Christmas special by emailing us at info@greensignals.org. But for now, that's it. Do join us again for our next regular episode, which will be published on Wednesday, as usual. About what? We're not really that sure, because it's always topical. We have got the second part of Scotland's Railway with Bill Reeve, of course, as the core of that show. And hopefully a rather special feature of something which is just a bit different, and you'll have to wait to find out about that. But for now, it's goodbye from me, Nigel Harris in chilly Lincolnshire, and
it's goodbye from me, Richard Bowker.